I know few would agree with the statement that the United Nations was formed to protect civilians and was formed to maintain peace, global peace and security. And many would support the statement that this organization has performed its duty. We all know, when we look at back in history, that the United Nations replaced the League of Nations in 1945 with the primary motive of preventing another world war. The United Nations came into place to maintain global peace and security, and let me say, protect civilians in case of war. Over the years, the legacy of the United Nations has been very, very negative. Since 1945, I want to say that many people have died as a result of war, compared to the number of people who died during World War I and World War II. Today, I must say that the United Nations has failed in its obligation to protect civilians, and it has failed in its obligation to maintain global peace and security. And I am driven to argue that the United Nations is, in my view, the cause of all wars in the world today. I checked on the history of Libya and how the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council handled the case of Muammar Gaddafi and Libya as a whole. And from reading the history of that country, I am convinced that the United Nations is not concerned with global peace and security. I am convinced that the United Nations is concerned with creating disorder and promoting all sorts of violence in the world. I know many will support this my assertion. Now, when we look at the case of Libya, the United Nations on 17th March 2011, the United Nations authorized military intervention in Libya to protect civilians, and this authorization was given to a multi-state NATO-led coalition, which began the implementation of this authorization on 19th March 2011. Authorization was given on 17th March, then the implementation started on 19th March, that is around 2 days after. The direction was for the NATO-led coalition to implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 in response to events during the first Libyan civil war. Now, NATO members were allowed to launch attacks in Libya, and according to a statement that was delivered by David Cameron, for those who are acquainted with history, you will understand that David Cameron was the UK Prime Minister, United Kingdom Prime Minister. And according to what David Cameron said on the UK Prime Minister said on 21st March 2011, that is around 3 days after the launch of the attacks in Libya, he said that the resolution, the approval that the United Nations gave, which was considered legal authority, it did not authorize the removal of Muammar Gaddafi by military action. That is according to what David Cameron said, that the UN resolution authorization did not allow the removal of Libyan president, that is Muammar Gaddafi, by military action. The head of the armed forces said it absolutely did not allow the targeting of Colonel Gaddafi. When I read another specific report on the same statement, you will find that coalition forces, including those from the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, say they are trying to protect civilians from attacks by the ruling regime. Now, we find that United Kingdom, France, and the US were directly involved in the Libyan intervention. And if you follow my statements, you will find that the United Nations gave directives that the intervention was not to target Gaddafi. This means that Gaddafi was to be safeguarded. He was to be safe during this intervention. And I believe that it was the responsibility of these invading governments to protect Gaddafi. And I also read a number of statements across very many articles, news platforms, that claiming that these foreign governments were not allowed by the United Nations to target Gaddafi or kill Gaddafi for that matter. What was the result? What was the result of this, the so-called NATO-led delegation, a multi-state NATO-led coalition that intervened in Libya in 2011? What was the result? The primary result of this intervention was, one, the death of Muammar Gaddafi, and two, prolonged instability in the country. The United Nations stated clearly that the authority that it gave the NATO-led coalition was that Gaddafi was to be protected. Gaddafi was not to be killed, and Gaddafi was not to be removed from power through military action. But the opposite happened. What the UN warned these governments about is what they did, is what happened. Who should be held accountable? And have they been held accountable since then? The United Kingdom has not been held accountable. France has not been held accountable. The United States has not been held accountable. Has even the United Nations questioned what these governments did to Muammar Gaddafi? Have they questioned why these governments killed Muammar Gaddafi? And what have they done in the case of Muammar Gaddafi? Why are they silent? I can compare this with the case of the Russian president, that is Vladimir Putin, who is currently engaged in fierce war with Ukraine. And the United Nations has the ICC, let me say the ICC, International Criminal Court, has delivered has delivered a warrant of arrest to Putin simply for attacking Ukraine and they say killing civilians. Yet, on the other hand, we have governments, we have individuals who have admitted to blundering in Libya, who went against the United Nations resolutions, who went against and criticized and, let me say, turned a blind eye to United Nations approvals. They went ahead and killed a president, head of state. You know, a president is in charge of millions of people. When you kill a leader, that means that you have committed direct assault on the people. When these people killed Muammar Gaddafi, it means that they directly killed the dreams of Libyans. They directly killed the destinies of Libyans. And this is what happened. Why is the United Nations quiet about the case of Muammar Gaddafi? Why is the United Nations Security Council quiet about what happened in Libya? Why hasn't the ICC given these individuals who admitted to have blundered in Libya warrant of arrest. It is almost 12 years since the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Almost 12 years since the death of Muammar Gaddafi. And despite many government officials in France, in the United States, in France, admitting to have blundered in killing Muammar Gaddafi, the ICC has not delivered even a single warrant of arrest to these individuals. You remember Tony Blair admitted to have blundered in the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. And from just the statement that I have read, David Cameron, who was the UK Prime Minister, also admitted that they did wrong to kill Muammar Gaddafi. It was a blunder to kill Muammar Gaddafi. The UN provisions did not provide for the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, but it provided for the protection of civilians. I think the United Nations should act in fairness.